Hi all, in this video we are going to discuss about the exception basics. We are going to discuss on the description of an exception, technical definition of an exception, and we're going to see the different types of exception that exist in Java exception concept. So the definition goes here. When a program violates the semantic constraints of the Java programming language, the Java Virtual Machine, the JVM, signals this error to be the program as an exception. So meaning is whenever we are violating the semantic constraints. So semantic constraints are something which occurs as a rule during the runtime. And if we are not following that constraints appropriately during the runtime of an application, then literally the virtual machine is going to signal this as an error. And that error is what we call it as an exception, right? So it's a pretty straightforward definition. And an example for such violation is like semantic constraints are like index out of bounds. So the semantic constraint says that you need to access the array index within the initialized index positions like 0, 1, and 2. You will not be able to access the third index if in case that index doesn't exist. But if you violate that rule and if you go and try to access the index position which doesn't exist in an array, then literally the JVM is going to signal that as an array to the program as an exception, and that type of exception that's going to be signaled by the JVM is array index out of bounds exception. And if that exception is not going to be handled, then we knew what's going to happen. Your application is going to get terminated abruptly. So this is a general definition on exception. But technically, we need to see what are the different types of exception that exist in Java. The first exception is checked exception. Yeah, it's a pretty notable statement. The first type of exception that we have is checked exception. The next type of exception that we have is unchecked exception. So we need to understand what's the difference between a checked exception and unchecked exception more in detail. Checked exceptions are the exceptions which can be predicted by the compiler. When the compiler can predict the type of exception during the compilation time itself, then it is called as a checked exception. So what the compiler can do on the checked exception is it can identify if that syntax is going to end up with any exception at runtime, can be intimated by the compiler to the programmer. Programmer might have forgotten to embrace the snippets with try and catch, and that statement actually leads to an exception at runtime, and the compiler can trace out. If such type of exceptional statements are seen by the compiler, then and intimated by the compiler, then it is called as an checked exception. On the other hand, unchecked exceptions are the exceptions which cannot be traced out by the compiler. Compiler can't trace out that, and compiler can't intimate to the programmer saying that, hey, this line might end up with an exception. Such type of exceptions are called as unchecked exceptions, and unchecked exceptions are known only at the runtime. So example for unchecked exceptions are index out of bounds exception. In our earlier snippets in the videos, when I was discussing about the snippet, there I explained that array index out of bounds exceptions are occurring, but the compiler can't identify that because it's an unchecked exception where the compiler can't trace out. But another example that we can take is file handling. When we are going for a concept of file handling in Java, there we tend to have the exception categories listed as checked exceptions, right? So before we get into the more detailed understanding of checked exception and unchecked exception, let's have a quick understanding of the hierarchy of exception classes that we have in Java. The topmost class in the hierarchy of exception classes is throwable. On top of the throwable is object. As we all knew, the topmost class that we have in Java is object. Any class is a subclass of object class. Now underneath the throwable, you can find that there are two categories of exception types. The throwable types, I'm sorry. One, the error. Another one is exception. Error has some set of error type classes like out of memory error, stack overflow error, linkage error, and so on. Wherein in terms of exception, if you see, we have runtime exceptions and IO exceptions. There are further types of exceptions are also there. But more relevantly, under the runtime exceptions, you can figure out the index out of bounds exception. So index out of bound exceptions comes under the category of runtime exception. Runtime exceptions are one good example for unchecked exception. Illegal argument exception is an unchecked exception where the compiler can't identify these types of exception. And the same is applicable for error as well. Errors are something which the compiler can't trace out, wherein if you look at the yellow highlighted subclasses of exception classes, IO exception, file not found exception, socket exceptions, all these exceptions are checked exceptions, meaning is the compiler itself can trace the exception. If you have a line of statements which leads to an IO related issue, file not found issues, then probably the compiler can intimate the programmer stating that, hey, you have to handle an exception for this line of statement. Otherwise, the compiler will not allow you to compile the code. But that's not the case on the runtime exception types. These type of classes, all these are classes, right? These type of classes are unchecked exceptions where the compiler literally can't identify the exceptions in the statements. So these are called as unchecked exceptions, whereas IO exceptions, and example for checked exceptions, means the compiler can identify the type of exceptions on the line of statements that you've written on the program, and the compiler will enforce you to embrace it with the try and catch in order to handle the exceptions that might occur in the line of statement. So these are all the important aspects of points that we have to make a note of it when it comes to the exceptions discussion. We'll discuss more in detail about this checked and unchecked exceptions with more interesting demos, and also we'll come to the understanding of the differences between an error and an exception. This is very much important because we need to know how it is getting differentiated between an error type of exceptions and exception itself. But if you notice here, error and exceptions are coming under the throwable. Throwable is mapped to the topmost class called object. So this is a simple hierarchy, but actually the hierarchy of exception is pretty vast. It's a little elaborated, but I've just shortened it here to understand the base hierarchy and the important classes that are part of the exception class hierarchy. So in the next video, we'll be having more demonstrative understanding of these exceptions in detail. Thank you.